October the 4th, day one of the nationwide invasion, as between 5 and 6 a.m., as the Combat Engineer Battalion of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade made its first of two canal crossings. It had been attacked on both its right and left flanks simultaneously by hundreds of armed reactionary local civilian attackers. Aiding in this crossing was massive artillery support from the firing batteries comprising the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade's artillery battalion, equipped with the highly capable and mobile self-propelled PLZ-07 howitzers. As pre-prepared strike packages put together via the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, utilizing, of course, the massive ISR apparatus and corresponding targeting data derived from such, were passed down to the FDC elements of each firing battery. Resistance along the first canal was simply smashed in conjunction with a potent Su-34 airstrike from a single Su-34 strike aircraft from the allocated Russian VVS Su-34 squadron. Not only did these actions occur to support the combat engineers with the lion's share of the artillery firepower, at least initially, but some fire missions began to impact recent fighting now occurring at Vidor as well, a small rural town to the immediate east of the city of Beaumont. As the Recon Battalion of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade likewise had already arrived in Vidor by as early as 5 a.m., artillery strikes initially here were small as they moved into the town, but would be more forthcoming as the battle developed by 6 a.m., by which point the heavy fire missions to assist the crossing over the first canal northbound by the Combat Engineer Battalion will have since concluded. Moving into Vidor, the Recon Battalion had within this small, albeit critical node, several important objectives of its own. Seizing the I-10 Neches River Bridge would be a major objective, along with securing I-10 through the town of Vidor itself. Part of the latter would see an additional objective of guarding the rear flank of the 1st Recon Company to arrive to seize the I-10 Neches River Bridge. Moreover, as well as this, to also fix in place an emerging American defending force of armed reactionary civilian militia, numbering some roughly 750 personnel. This militia force, having had mustered together merely a few hours prior, were natives of the town of Vidor and had been informed of sightings of the PLAN Marines by both standard travelers moving through the area and refugees alike. Initially conducting reconnaissance of their own pertaining to the armed reactionary civilian militia personnel using scouting parties, this was due to there being no ISR or communications equipment available, of course due to the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes, as well as adding to it being the electronic warfare assets used by the coalition to jam redundant equipment, which included items like radios. As the Recon Battalion gradually moved in to take positions in the town, combat erupted between both sides as contact had been made. If we go to the map, in the town of Vidor, by 5 a.m., as the leading elements of the PLAN 6th Marine Brigade's reconnaissance element had arrived in the area, one company had moved immediately to seize the I-10 Neches River Bridge, which was a critically important objective, not only because it was part of I-10, which was a massively important major invasion route for the external invasion components of the fourth-generation warfare doctrines being levied against the country, but also because this was one of the few remaining crossing points across the tributaries located throughout this battle space that had not been annihilated by the PLAN cruise missile strikes coming in from the Renhai-class guided missile cruisers and the Yuan-class submarines. As the three recon companies that had moved into the town itself had set up a line of contact pushing inwards into the town of Vidor. This would be important not only to guard the rear flanks of the company holding the bridge as they prevented the armed reactionary civilian militia forces from moving to attack them from behind, but also would fix these forces in place so that the reinforcements arriving into the area, which should be effectively the entire medium combined arms battalion, which had taken positions along a sizable segment of I-10, which, as they had found it was clear of any defending forces, would move immediately to strike the armed reactionary civilian militia elements in the town on their flanks, as they would hit them moving westwards from the east of the town. The three companies of the Recon Battalion holding positions in the general south of the town along both I-10 and also State Highway 12 would maintain these positions with the headquarters and support company behind this line to provide logistical and command capabilities to the combat companies of the Recon Battalion, the reconnaissance companies holding the line in the town, as well as the company holding the bridge, which would also shortly, by 6 a.m., be reinforced by the last three recon companies arriving into the area, which would move to hold positions along the bridge, with the first company having had already arrived by 5 a.m., as by 6 the other three would arrive, making the entire recon battalion in the immediate Vidor area, as the last three recon companies were finishing up annihilating a pocket of armed reactionary civilians that had mustered together to the immediate west of the small city of Orange. As they had effectively moved into the town and also took control of this entry and exit point to Beaumont, which was absolutely critical to hold as it prevented escape from the military and armed civilians inside the city, as they were also prevented from escape by the Air Assault Battalion, which dropped off its ground-based forces in two key locations, both the State Highway 96 bridge in the north, which was left intact from the recent cruise missile strikes, as well as also another massively important I-10 bridge across a few canals to the immediate southwest of the city of Beaumont, as the Air Assault and Recon battalions effectively held total control of the last remaining entry and exit points into Beaumont. The Combat Engineer Battalion, which had recently finished fighting along the first canal it had to cross to on a sweep north into Beaumont, would be joined by the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, which effectively by this point had taken a logistical pause to allow for the combat engineers, now fresh out of combat, to catch up with them and move into the city of Beaumont to sweep all the objectives clear of all defending personnel and to capture them intact, which included the military port facilities, the actual port infrastructure and rail infrastructure intact, as well as also the energy infrastructure intact, which was also in this port area, as this was all massively important to the coalition in terms of the local objectives. The final annihilation of the defending forces within Beaumont was also massively important, as Beaumont was a critical node itself through which the external invasion prong of PLA Group Armies 15 through 20, minus of course Group Army 15, which had been shed off in Houston for occupation duties to replace the PLA's active duty 83rd Group Army to move to the northeast of Texas, would move through I-10 through this entire battle space, including through the node of Beaumont, with Vidor also being a much smaller but still important key node along this invasion route, as it literally sat on the I-10 Neches River Bridge. This node had to be swept clean of all defending forces as well, and this would be the task of both the Recon Battalion and soon to arrive Medium Combined Arms Battalion, which was pushing its way into the town from the east, moving westward, as this potent battalion had a company of the ZBD-05 assault guns slash light tanks, as well as 4 heavy amphibious marine infantry companies equipped solely with the IFV version of the ZBD-05s, as well as a combat engineer company and their 82 millimeter mortar company and headquarters and support company, which were the command and logistical elements over the Medium Combined Arms Battalion. As the recon battalion companies operating within Vidor had established a line facing to the northwest, they, with their potent Lynx all-terrain vehicles equipped with their armored shells to protect them from small arms fire and their very powerful, destructive 12.7 millimeter Jiangxi Gatling machine guns, would shred the defending forces to pieces, and of course would increasingly have heavier and heavier artillery support while so doing, as the PLZ-07 howitzers, comprising the firing batteries of the PLAN 6 Marine Brigade's Artillery Battalion, were still conducting fire missions, as they were also carrying out a phased advance from their first firing position to a new firing position, from which point they would continue to support operations in Vidor, in Beaumont, and of course the 2 air assault marine infantry companies holding the I-10 bridge to the southwest of Beaumont, as they would continually receive attacks from armed reactionary civilian elements moving through the area, and some purposely conducting counterattacks, as the initial attacks on these forces upon their being landed had massively failed, and that was due in large part to the enormous air power available to support those forces at that bridge across those canals to the southwest of Beaumont on I-10. As the J-10 fighters, although by this point preparing to leave the battlefield to conduct an RTB to rearm from mostly air-to-air munitions to predominantly air-to-ground munitions, with the exception of a single pair of PL-12 air-to-air missiles on each wingtip as per SOP, these would add massive capabilities in terms of close air support to the ground forces, as initially each aircraft in the 2 J-10 fighter squadrons was only equipped with a single pair of precision laser-guided 1,000-pound munitions, while it was left mostly up to the Russian Su-34 strike aircraft to conduct the vast majority of the ground strikes, whether as close air support operations or pre-planned strikes at the opening of the invasion, as by now, with the town of Vidor under heavy assault and the armed reactionary civilian militia personnel now massing together to try to repel this assault against their town, as again, as mentioned before, these militias had formed as a direct response to the criminal elements brought in as a direct result of the massive immigration crisis. But now we're facing a powerful foe in terms of a professionally armed, trained, equipped, and led military force, which they were effectively unable to essentially contend with in their current state, as they lacked any real anti-tank weaponry other than Molotov cocktails, which are only effective at very short ranges and very dangerous to get into range to use, and also no air defense weapons, such as man-portable air defense systems, and a very weak logistical system, although unlike the vast majority of armed reactionary civilians, they at least had a form of a logistical system, although it was, again, a very weak system, as it was mostly built around quantities of fuel for their technicals, as well as small arms ammunition and MREs and canned food, and also bottled water. That was effectively the entire logistical system of this militia group, as everyone contributed to this system, as people spent their own money to acquire many of these items to stockpile in their makeshift militia headquarters located inside of Vidor, which incidentally would become a target for a J-10 strike carried out by two laser-guided 1,000-pound munitions. As again, the J-10s would linger over the battle space even after the entirety of the USAF, U.S. Navy Aviation, and U.S. Marine Corps Aviation had been entirely destroyed between 5 and 5:30, where every last vestige of these elements had been wiped out. And again, they would linger over the battle space for a few more hours before conducting a phased withdrawal to do their RTB, to rearm and refuel and conduct any needed maintenance procedures after having had been in the air for an extended amount of time. Of course, the mid-air refueler would remain on station in the form of an IL-78 that, upon running out of fuel for both itself and the aircraft, would do its own RTB to immediately be switched out with another one, as they kept a rotation of IL-78s on station. A single IL-78 would always remain in this battle space to support this miniature air armada of the two J-10 fighter squadrons and single Su-34 strike aircraft squadron. As now, if we go to the map of the fighting in Vidor, as it was now 6 a.m. after the initial line of contact had been established between the three PLAN Marine recon companies of the 6th Marine Brigade's Recon Battalion and against the armed reactionary civilian militia personnel inside of Vidor. The fighting would be very heavy at first, as if we go to the map, this area effectively was near the downtown of Vidor, if it could be called that, as again, this was a relatively small town. The local big box store was only a mile away in the north central portion of town to the immediate northwest of this map. To the immediate south, just immediately off map to the south and southwest, was the downtown area, within which sat the headquarters and support company over the entire recon battalion, as they commanded the operations of their battalion and provided logistical support, as they would run fuel, ammunition, food, water, and more out to their combat companies at the lines of contact that had developed. As in this particular part of town, within this 1 by 1 mile area, two companies were operating here, as this was a whole company moving into this area along State Highway 12, and this platoon, and this platoon comprised another company with the third of the three combat recon companies just off this map and immediately to the southwest along I-10. And further to the southwest off this map was the I-10 Neches River Bridge, where by now one company had already been in place to guard entry and exit from this bridge, and now by 6 a.m. the remaining three combat companies of recon companies were moving in to bolster the presence, which was already this single company. Now there would be four companies, as these forces had formed a line of contact to prevent attack against the rear of these companies holding the bridge, and also to fix in place these armed reactionary militia civilian forces as long as possible to be able to wipe as many of them out and also keep them occupied, as the medium combined arms battalion's forces were now moving into the town from the east, striking westward in force as they entered. As the medium combined arms battalion, as it struck into the town, would attack with three of its combat companies, one being its light tank / assault gun company of the ZBD-05 light tank / assault guns, and two of its heavy marine amphibious infantry companies moving into the town as well, with the other two heavy marine amphibious infantry companies facing to the east and away from town, as between the three attacking companies and the two additional heavy amphibious marine infantry companies facing towards the general east would sit the 82 millimeter mortar company for fire support of this operation, as well as the combat engineer company held back as a sort of reserve force that could be sent in if needed, and also the headquarters and support company, which were the command and logistical elements over the entire medium combined arms battalion. As the recon battalion, of course, had its command and logistical forces of its headquarters and support company sitting back in the downtown area just off this map, as they would logistically support this operation of their three attacking companies, plus the companies now holding the bridge, and also command the operation of their forces that were operating in this part of Vidor. As the militia personnel operating in the town of Vidor would be very resourceful in this battle, as they would utilize everything possible to their advantage in terms of terrain, such as the wooded areas scattered throughout the town and around it, as well as also the drainage systems and drainage ditches, as well as also using certain basement levels of certain buildings, which offered them additional protection from the massive shelling that was now starting to rained down heavy on the town, as initially there were only a relatively small number of artillery strikes in comparison to the heavy strikes that were going on against the armed civilians attacking the combat engineer battalion on its crossing of the First Canal, with limited strikes against Vidor initially. And now, with this operation over with and the combat engineers continuing their advance, the artillery would come in now more heavy, not just on Vidor, but also on the objectives in Beaumont, the military objectives, and would additionally be coming in to support and defend the two air assault marine infantry companies holding the I-10 bridge to the southwest of Beaumont across the canal system, as now the artillery would again come in very heavy into Vidor. The armed reactionary civilian militia personnel operating inside the town would conduct a series of hit and run attacks, although when many would try to flee, they would be outright annihilated, as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system would calculate highly accurate fire missions for the field artillery of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade in the form of its PLZ-07 artillery battalion, as the 122 millimeter shelling would be highly concentrated, and only small groups of armed reactionary civilian militia personnel operating in this area would make it to other parts of the town with their lives, as initially, as the recon battalion gradually pushed into town, small-scale fights in terms of firefights were breaking out between the two sides, as the armed reactionary civilian militia personnel were trying to send out scouting parties to see if they could make contact with the enemy in the form of the PLAN Marines, as they had to figure out roughly where enemy forces were. And as a result of this contact, the massive firefights that broke out shredded the armed reactionary civilian militia personnel to pieces with the massive firepower of the 12.7 millimeter Jiangxi Gatling heavy machine guns, as well as also the versions of the Lynx ATVs that were not armored and had simple crew serve weapons, such as this Type 77 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun. Although this fired the same caliber as the Jiangxi Gatling machine gun, its rate of fire was nowhere near as devastating as this weapon was, as this could spit out massively more lead in a shorter amount of time, causing utter annihilation and devastation. It could chop trees down with its rate of fire, as this anti-materiel weapon could also shred through many types of building materials with relative ease as well, as now each of these Lynx ATVs 2 per squad, as each one could carry roughly a half squad. There were 10 in each platoon. As these 3 platoons moved into the area, they sought to establish a more coherent line of contact against the armed reactionary civilian militia threat that had emerged into this area. As the ISR apparatus had an iron grip over this and virtually every other single solitary battle space throughout this invasion, every movement was seen, with very few exceptions, such as if personnel were traveling underground through sewage and drainage systems or basement levels, or under very thick coniferous wooded areas, such as where there were juniper woodlands and such. The vast majority of personnel that were moving out in the open were seen and thus were targeted with pre-prepared strike packages put together for not just the artillery forces of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade of its artillery battalion of PLZ-07 122mm howitzers, but also for additional airstrikes. As by this point, at 6 a.m., not all of the Su-34 strike aircraft had jettisoned their entire payloads, nor had all of the J-10 fighter aircraft done the same, as there were still many of these J-10s throughout both J-10 squadrons allocated to this battle space that still had their pair of 1,000-pound laser-guided precision munitions. And in this operation, both air power and artillery power would be utilized heavily, as now these armed reactionary civilian militia personnel had moved into this thickly wooded area along the access road of I-10 here. This, being a local middle school, had 110 armed reactionary civilian militia personnel within it, and there were more arriving. Although some would flee before the artillery strikes would come in, most of the flight would be a direct result of the heavy ground-based firepower that would be levied into these areas by the Lynx ATVs and some of the dismounted troops from such. As the map opens up at 6 a.m., this platoon of this company is moving straight north up this street, while this platoon had spread out even through some of the backyards of these working-class homes just north of the downtown area, as there were sheds, which are these smaller blocks. These are the working-class smaller homes in this neighborhood, fences, and there were gas station, there were businesses and restaurants in this area, as well as there were wooded areas scattered throughout the town, too. There were ample numbers of different hiding places for the militia personnel to attempt to take refuge within. As in this particular scene, this could essentially be anywhere. This could be inside of a town, it could be outside of a town in a rural area, or it could be inside of a town where there are homes and wooded areas scattered about. And the same could be the case here, where these PLAN Marines are opening fire on this building. This could either be a home or a small business, and it's a brick building within which the armed reactionary civilian militia personnel are taking cover and attempting to lay down fire against the PLAN Marine forces, who are vigorously returning fire back, including with 35mm tube-fired grenades, which one being fired off of this illustration or animation, a hand grenade being thrown into this building, small arms fire being laid down, as well as scenes such as this were common as well, as troops would take positions along roads in the drainage ditches and use them for a form of cover against the forces they were thereby attacking, as also when towns and cities became more heavily damaged by a combination of artillery, airstrikes, mortar strikes, and more, of course, rubble became outstanding fighting positions for the forces involved. As we go to the map of the fighting now unfolding within the heart of Vidor, as this was just one section of the town, which was now heavily embattled, as the recon battalion were the first to arrive on scene, shortly followed up by the medium combined arms battalion striking into town from the east, the Lynx ATVs of this platoon were laying down heavy fire, although taking return fire from this squad-sized element coming out from behind this small business, attempting to lay down fire. As these technicals are going past on the access road, they're attempting to lay down fire as well, but get immediately shredded up by the immense firepower of the Lynx ATV and its Jiangxi Gatling autocannon, which shreds these technicals and the personnel therein to complete and total pieces, as the vehicles became hole-riddled, smoking hulks of metal with massive quantities of body fluids and body parts shredded up therein. The fighting was now becoming more and more intense in this area, as the headquarters platoon, which was just off map, not to be confused with the headquarters and support company, which was a whole company of the command and logistical elements of the entire battalion. The headquarters platoon of this recon combat company of PLA and Marines was just off the map in this area, as an ambulance vehicle from their combat medics of their headquarters platoon would be sent into this area to retrieve PLAN wounded, as they would suffer some wounded in this particular battle, as heavy fire was being exchanged in terms of small arms fire from these technicals and the personnel in the back, including these technicals and these technicals, as these vehicles were moving up the street. They also laid down fire into these personnel in the parking lots of these fast food places, who were caught off guard by the rapid arrival of this platoon, while these vehicles were shredded up by the Gatling autocannons of the Lynx ATVs, the Jiangxi Gatling autocannons, firing rapid quantities and massive quantities of 12.7 millimeter ammunition into these vehicles and personnel, including over here, as these vehicles defeated these forces and then gradually moved into place, including moving through people's yards, as mentioned. The headquarters platoon, having had fired 2 of its CH-901A loitering munitions, the single-tube versions, as again they lacked the 48-tube TEL-based system that the PLA ground forces or Army operated, they still had specially trained drone operators in the headquarters platoons most often that could utilize these systems, as one had already been fired earlier. They sought out targets of opportunity as they were set on the AI target-seeking mode, which included targets on the highways themselves or on higher buildings. As they were not finding any targets on building tops, they would eventually hit vehicles that had entered the highway system and were now trying to escape from town. But this company's headquarters platoon had likewise fired 2 of their single tube-based CH-901As with fragmentation warheads, as were equipped on these as well, which would slam into these 2 technicals on the northbound lane of State Highway 12, destroying them immediately, while others would continue to fly on and hit personnel in these dugouts, as these were somewhat protected from fire that was going on above the ground, as they could lay down in the prone position and effectively not be hit by the very potent 12.7 millimeter fire that was raking up and down this wooded area and elsewhere, including in the middle school building, smashing through its windows and even tearing through some of its walls, hitting personnel inside and eliminating them. As a grouping of 110 armed reactionary civilian militia personnel had taken position inside the middle school, an additional 300 had spread out, partly on but off the map, in a wooded area along State Highway 12, with only 80 making it out with their lives, as 80 would retreat after roughly 20 minutes of a heavy exchange of fire, as the fighting in this area would last a total of a single hour within this 1 by 1 mile battle space. The quantity of fire being laid down was simply gargantuan, as although the recon battalion was a light force in terms of its equipment and capabilities, its firepower was still extremely heavy in terms of what it was up against, being up against simple armed militia civilians. As this technical flew out from behind this building as it had come from another area, it dropped off a squad-sized element in this building, while this platoon, with its 10 Lynx ATVs with their armored shells would move into place around these buildings as 4 vehicles would move here and lay down fire and destroy the technical. They would dismount one of their squads while these 2 would move into this area here as these 4 moved here. This one and this one would move here, being 2. They would drop off a squad as well. The first squad would go in the bottom floor of the building to wipe out the squad-sized element that dismounted into this building at the opening of this map, while they dismounted a single squad to go in the bottom level, while the squad that was dismounted from these 2 Lynx ATVs that were now here to cover them as they threw their grappling hook on the roof and effectively climbed up onto the roof to take positions on the roof to lay down fire across the highway as they could see down and under the highway and hit enemy personnel in this area from their positions on the roof of this business. As this grouping of 4 had come around, they had fired briefly just several small arms rounds at these 2 Lynx ATVs, which immediately peppered them and shred these 4 personnel to pieces with their 12.7 millimeter fire, just as they did these technicals with armed personnel trying to shoot at them, which were promptly and immediately shredded to pieces and destroyed. As these vehicles moved into place from the same platoon, another 3 would move up here and 1 would move here before they would all join together as a grouping of 4 vehicles and spread out through this area and lay down fire over into this point right there after having had already destroyed these technicals and the personnel therein. As this platoon moved on the right flank of this platoon, they had destroyed all of these technicals, and this technical had moved around as it was, for the time being, safe behind this building, but would be shredded up by fire by these vehicles by the time they arrived here, before they then would attack this technical, as they had already destroyed these technicals, with fire coming down from the lead 2 Lynx ATVs, as well as them also being hit by the arrival of this company in an L vector of fire, as that was an excellent manner by which to vector firepower, as it economized the firepower and maximized the effects. And the vectoring of fire was highly efficient when being used in this manner against enemy forces, as they could be hit on 2 different sides simultaneously. As then, therefore, after defeating all these forces, as this recon company moved in and established positions both on and off the map, laying down fire into this area, as these forces, the 300, arrive partially on but most off the map. The platoon here, having had moved through this area along this building in its parking lot of this business, would then move and set up positions here, as they could then mutually support one another with interlocking fields of fire, including with platoons from this company moving into this area. Interlocking fields of fire between all the platoons of the different companies involved. Even the company immediately off this map to the southwest would have interlocking fields of fire with this platoon from this company, as they could also support the next platoon down and off the map from the other company off the map. Interlocking fields of fire, very tactical vectoring of fire. As they spread out into this area, and this company spread out both on and off the map, this platoon was moving into place here, and 2 Lynxes here, and the last vehicles over here laying down heavy fire with a dismounted squad on the roof that had climbed the roof with a grappling hook, and the first squad having had cleared the bottom floor as they breached the building and cleared it of armed reactionary civilian militia personnel in 2 different stack teams as they methodically and rapidly moved through this building, clearing it in a highly efficient manner. As now they could lay down fire from both inside of this building on the first floor after having had captured it, with the other squad on the top floor laying down fire. They now had multiple venues from which to lay down fire against these forces on the other side of the highway network, both I-10, which moved through this area, and connected to State Highway 12, which moved through this area, as the right lane here had a switch-off lane to get onto State Highway 12 where it begun, and State Highway 12 also had a lane to merge onto I-10 in this area, as the other lanes continued in this direction and this direction. As there was also entry and exit points, for the most part, the highway was cleared of most vehicles by now, as many refugees had since either moved through the area or had abandoned their vehicles, as seeing abandoned vehicles by this point in time was not uncommon on the highways and in people's yards and driveways and elsewhere on city streets. Abandoned vehicles were a very common sight everywhere in this invasion by this point. And many of them had been caught up in the crossfire, wherein there had been many innocents having had their lives taken as a result of such. But most of the time, the PLA and Marines did not deliberately target non-combatants. Although, again, if they had gotten in the way, they were collateral damage and they just got in the way. But at this point, fire was being laid down heavily across I-10 right here and State Highway 12, as these companies were now moved into place throughout this area with mutually supporting fields of fire. So effectively, within the first 20 to 30 minutes, these forces had moved into place and established positions amid these buildings within their Lynx ATVs and a few dismounted squads. Again, an ambulance vehicle from the headquarters platoon of this company would move in onto the map and pick up a few wounded from the operations occurring at this business over here and flee with them to take them to safety to work on them as they had wounds to the extremities. It was not severe, but they were wounds nonetheless that had to be treated, as now fire was being laid from on top of, within the building, and from around it from the platoon's vehicles, now all in place in this area. This platoon now in this position here, firing across here. And this whole company and its 3 combat platoons and headquarters platoon behind it were laying down fire in this area, while to the north, to the northeast, in the general east of the town, north of this map, the forces of the Medium Combined Arms Battalion were at this point now pushing into town from the east, moving west against the armed reactionary civilian population of militia personnel within this particular town. And the fighting was heavy, as by 6:30 a.m., the fixing in place of the forces across the highway had been highly effective, as by now massive artillery strikes were now being passed down from the real-time AI battlefield data processing system to the FDC elements within the firing batteries, as each firing platoon on the gun line had an FDC element, or an FDC section, which would receive the pre-prepared strike packages and pass them down to the gun lines, who would in turn conduct the fire missions against the targets that had been selected. As the target's selection was more accurate than was ever before possible in all human history, the fatality rate, the casualty rate, was exceptionally higher than would normally be the case. And that just didn't go for artillery. It also went for the airstrikes and also mortar strikes and other ground units, as they could vector their firepower far more efficiently than was ever before conceivable. And thus, the casualties on the American side went up exponentially higher than, again, would have been the case otherwise without the artificial intelligence system guiding every aspect of these operations and the invasion. By now, many of these personnel were starting to retreat, as the fire from these platoons of this and the other companies involved off of the map, both partially on this map and off of it, and also off of this map to the southwest, the fire was becoming exceedingly heavy from the Lynx ATVs and some of the dismounted troops in the town, as they fired their heavy weapons like their Gatling Jiangxi machine guns, and also their small arms, and also their anti-tank guided missiles like their HJ-08s, as well as also their Type 69 RPGs, 35 millimeter grenades, and other weapons. As the troops or the militia personnel had managed to retreat into some of these buildings, 10 would get left behind in this warehouse building, while the other 10 would flee into the next building and continue onward and out of the area. 7 personnel moving through this drainage ditch would flee the area with their lives through this thickly wooded area consisting of a large number of juniper trees, which masked their IR signatures and helped camouflage them to a certain extent, while 50 personnel had moved up and tried to join this battle, but would then realize that that was not a wise decision and would ultimately flee back to other parts of town from whence they had come, as the 10 would continue to retreat out of this building. Other forces would join the battle, including these 2 technicals that would drop off 2 squad-sized elements that would run and bound in cover and drop in the prone and try to lay down fire, but would be hit from the squad that was on top of this building that had grappled onto the roof and were now firing down at these personnel, as well as the direct fire coming from the Lynx ATVs at the ground level and would shred these personnel to absolute pieces, as well as this grouping of 3 technicals coming from the parking lot of the middle school by the football field, the soccer field, and the baseball diamond, and dropping off 3 squad-sized elements who would try to do the same, but ultimately all of the artillery, as these were all imminent strike markers for artillery, would come crashing into this area, as anywhere where movement was spotted by the ISR apparatus and the targeting data could be derived from would be smashed to pieces in artillery strikes. As there were J-10 fighters, again, still lingering over this battle space, they would contribute as well to this battle before they would begin their RTB operations a bit later in this battle, as they would again start returning to base before 9 a.m., as they would conduct a phased withdrawal bit by bit to conduct their RTBs, which would also include the Su-34 strike aircraft, which would finally jettison the last of their payloads before 9 a.m., which would occur in different operations happening throughout this battle space, including in the fighting that was happening concurrently in the small city of Orange. The fighting in this particular area, mostly for the time being, included massive artillery strikes, both off and on this map, as the 300 personnel that moved into this area, some of them on the map in this wooded area and others off of it, would also be struck by massive artillery fires, as each imminent strike marker was not a single artillery shell. It was multiple artillery shells hitting the same target, as also there would be repeated fire missions on the same target area, as well as the 122 millimeter shells were now flying in en masse and were now blasting numerous armed reactionary civilian personnel in the area to total pieces, as the technicals that were on this battlefield and the personnel that had been deployed from them would also get totally annihilated in these fire missions, if they hadn't already been, by the massive volleys of 12.7 millimeter fires coming from the small but potent armored Lynx ATVs, as the non-armored versions typically equip the headquarters platoons and also the headquarters and support company troops with the standard crew serve weapons, which included in this image or illustration or animation, if you will, the Type 77 heavy 12.7 millimeter machine gun, which again had a much slower rate of fire than this devastating Gatling 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun did. And as a result, as only 50 would escape this building, as they had tried in vain to lay down fire from it against these Lynx ATVs that were shredding through parts of the facade with their heavy volumes of 12.7 fire. 50 would escape, while others would be smashed in the heavy artillery barrage that struck and destroyed most of this large building, as repeated 122mm shells flew in and decimated over half of this building from where the fire had been seen coming from, as the quadcopter assets of the troops on the ground, of the recon squads or sections in each platoon, were running circuits throughout the entire battle space, mapping the entire area in real time, plotting on the combat data links on the maps thereupon in real time, all enemy positions and friendly positions in real time, as the quadcopters, along with the high altitude assets and satellite, all overlaid together to map the battlefield in real time, which the real-time AI battlefield data processing system utilized this data to crunch numerous domains of information, including using it to put together strike packages for artillery and other systems. And now, with this building completely destroyed, these 10 personnel that had not fled the building fast enough were wiped out in it, as well as dozens of other armed reactionary civilians in this wooded area, which was now blown to splinters and stumps, had all been wiped out in the massive artillery barrage, as these personnel had already in these dugouts, as there were about 4 in each dugout, had been hit by a CH-901A loitering munition with a fragmentation warhead. These areas were also heavily shelled around the baseball diamond and the soccer field, the football field, as these personnel were caught in the open and completely annihilated as they had tried to run to the building for cover. They were destroyed out in the open in the field. Most of these 110 were destroyed, again, minus 50 personnel that had managed to flee and get out of the building with their lives and flee to other parts of the town. Only 80 personnel out of the original 300 that had moved into this area on and off the map, spread out, would escape further into town with their lives to try to conduct hit-and-run operations. As besides the roughly 550 armed reactionary civilians that were on and immediately just off this map in this 1 by 1 mile battlefield, there were still 200 more armed reactionary civilians that were spread out deeper inside of the town and also to the southwest, while this 300 was spread out into part of this map, but mostly off this map. And again, some would escape with their lives, as dozens would make it out of this area before the artillery had come fully crashing down into it, as this battle would last between 6 and 7 a.m., at least in this area. The recon troops will have achieved largely their objective of fixing in place the vast majority of the armed reactionary civilian militia forces in this area and causing them to be thoroughly saturated by 122mm munitions from the PLZ-07 howitzers, firing numerous fire missions into this area with HE shells with PD fuses, or point detonation fuses, which blew the vast majority of the armed reactionary civilians and their vehicles in this area to complete total shreds. Although, again, dozens will have escaped, as these 50 moved in and quickly left. 10 left here, coming from this area in the woods. Another 15 would flee and move to the northwest. 50 would move to the immediate north, and 80 would move to the north to join the rest of the roughly 200 spread throughout the town. They would adjust their tactics accordingly, as they had witnessed the mass devastation that occurred near the downtown area of Vidor with the massive shelling by now, which will have concluded by 7 a.m., at least in this sector, as the PLAN Recon Marines would continue to hold their positions along the I-10 and State Highway 12 line of contact. They would hold these positions to continue to guard the rear flank of the 4 companies now holding the Neches River I-10 bridge, as well as also the headquarters and support company, which sat further back behind the three companies holding this line of contact in this area, while the armed reactionary civilian militia personnel were gradually fleeing deeper into the town. They would now be hit on their flank by the very powerful forces of the Medium Combined Arms Battalion, now having had struck into town from the east, striking westward by 6 a.m. As to the immediate north and slightly east of this particular battle map, another battle was happening simultaneously to the fighting that erupted between the recon PLAN Marines and the armed reactionary civilians, as other groupings of armed reactionary civilians that were to the north and slightly east of this area were now being mercilessly attacked by the light tank / assault gun company of the Medium Combined Arms Battalion, which would be the southernmost company of the Medium Combined Arms Battalion to strike westwards, while to their north, two of the four heavy amphibious marine infantry companies would likewise strike westwards from the east and into town, while again the other two would remain facing east to defend the rear flanks of the 82 millimeter mortar company, the headquarters and support company, and the combat engineers, which were held between the attacking forces and the two other heavy amphibious marine infantry companies guarding the rear flanks as a sort of reserve force. In the next video installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting fourth generation warfare doctrines through the lens of a Sino-Russian coalition invasion, the fighting to the slight north and east of this downtown highway junction area of Vidor would see the assault gun / light tank company of the Medium Combined Arms Battalion pushing avidly westward and into the town to ravage the defending forces, who were not anticipating such a powerful strike force as the Medium Combined Arms Battalion, with all of its heavy firepower, which included its ZBD-05 light tank / assault gun vehicles, as well as also even their very potent ZBD-05 IFV versions of these vehicles, with their 30mm autocannon, 12.7mm turret-based heavy machine gun, and HJ-73C ATGM mounted on a rail on the side of the turret. As this was a shorter range, but albeit very effective ATGM, it could even be useful, besides destroying armored vehicles such as main battle tanks and other vehicles, in destroying bunker systems. And as the armed reactionary civilian militia personnel, the defenders of Vidor as a militia force, had a cadre of Army and Marine veterans and other military veterans leading them and training them, they had trained them to use every terrain feature to their advantage. And as the artillery strikes were by now coming in strong on the town from the PLZ-07 Howitzer Battalion of the PLAN 6th Marine Brigade, many would seek shelter in what few basement levels of buildings they could find, as well as drainage and sewage systems where they could find them, as well as also storm cellars, in addition to wooded areas, both inside and immediately around the town as well. As the fighting would become more and more intense as the Medium Combined Arms Battalion pushed in, the level of desperation amongst the defending forces would likewise become more and more intense, as some of them would effectively risk their lives to try to eliminate a few PLAN vehicles in terms of the heavier, more potent ZBD-05s, both the light tank iterations slash assault gun, as well as also the IFV versions. Although they would sacrifice their lives in this endeavor to destroy these PLAN vehicles, they would see very little success. More to come in the next installation.